Hey, this is Joe from the Recording Revolution. Let's talk about vocal effects today, specifically the vocal effects that I use all the time in my mix template. But before we do, any mixing tip that I give you is fairly useless if you don't already have a mixing system. So if we were sitting down for coffee and I handed you a pen and a piece of paper and said, draw me your mixing system, could you do it? Do you have a system? Or is your approach more throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks kind of mix approach? If it's the latter, you need a system. Not so that you can turn your mixing process into some boring, rote, robotic type procedure, but so that you get consistently great results. If you haven't read my 5-step mix guide, you can read it in one sitting, and as soon as you try it, you'll see it'll transform your mixes. You can get your free copy at recordingrevolution.com/5-step mix. Okay, let's dive in. Let's kick things off with a few basics to make sure we're all on the same page. Up above me, you can see a yellow vocal track. Over to this side, you'll see this is the vocal track, and this is a reverb track. So let's say, for example, one of the vocal effects that we want to use on this track is reverb. It's a dry vocal. We want to have some nice room to it. Here's the dry vocal. I need to find a ceiling. Okay, so we want to add a reverb to it. What if you've never done any mixing? Your initial reaction might be, okay, I just want to put a reverb plugin on the channel. Just another plugin on that vocal itself. And then you come in here, and on the reverb, you set the mix knob to something like maybe 50%. So half of the vocal has reverb and half of it doesn't, and then you listen to see what it sounds like. I need to find. Okay, that's too much reverb, so you kind of pull it back to maybe 25%. I need to find a ceiling. Can you see a problem with this approach? There's a couple here. The first is if the reverb is creating any sort of muddy sort of a sound, I don't have a way of just EQing the reverb separate from the vocal. Now, there are some reverb plugins that have built-in EQ, so that's a moot point there. But in general, if I want to compress the vocal and then shape the tone and the reverb is baked in, there's not really a good and easy way to separate those out, and it can cause problems. The other big thing is, what if I want to send a second vocal to this reverb? Or if I've got like 12 backing vocals, which is something I do way too much, and I want them all to have reverb on them. With this approach, I would have to have 12 instances of this reverb plugin. Guess what? Reverbs can be pretty processor intensive. This one's not especially that way, but if I had 20 of them, I bet it would start to bog down my computer. And guess what? There's no need for it. If you've ever run live sound, or if you've ever been even just watched a live sound engineer work, you may notice they have a mixer and they have, this is going back a few decades, but they would have a mixer and they would have a rack with like a reverb, like a rack-mounted reverb, maybe a couple of rack-mounted delays. And what happens is they might have one reverb for the whole show. Well, how do you get reverb on more than one thing? Because they use something called sends. Now, you may already know this, but there are people who don't know this, so I have to talk about it just to make sure we're on the same page. So instead of putting the reverb on the individual track like this, we put it on its own channel. We call this a bus or an aux channel or an effects channel. And then we use sends to send a copy of the vocal to that. Just like we would use sends to send the vocalist a little more of herself in her monitor mix on stage. It's the same function. We're just using it in a studio environment to send the vocal to the reverb. So if I choose my room reverb as the destination, now I can turn this volume up and down to give myself more or less reverb. I need to find a ceiling. I need to be. Now, the one thing to keep in mind when you set things up on a send is you want to make sure that that reverb is set to 100%. Now, Studio One is smart and usually does it for you, but that's because we just want to hear reverb on this channel, and we just want to hear dry vocal on this channel. Now, I can do things to either without it affecting the other, right? I can EQ the vocal like crazy, but the reverb stays the same. Or, like I like to do, I can EQ the effect and it not affect the sound of the dry, prominent reverb or prominent vocal track. That actually brings me to my second point, which is don't forget to EQ your effects. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a mix setting where I'm adding reverb or delay to something and the vocal sounds thick and muddy, and I can't figure out what it is, so I go in and I start EQing the crap out of my vocal, trying to fix it, when the problem was the reverb. Let's just listen to this reverb by itself. I need to find a ceiling. It's not too bad, but for whatever reason, a lot of reverbs that I've used over the years, the default kind of sound has a crap load of low end in it. It just has this extra woo 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 to it. And in a mix, it can make things sound muddy. Now, with just the vocal, it's probably not too bad. I need to find a ceiling. You feel that woo 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 that's there? If we turn the reverb off, we don't hear that nearly as much. I need to find a ceiling. So that warmth, that muddiness that we're trying to hunt down isn't the vocal, it's the reverb. So if we come to the reverb and we use an EQ like this, that just rolls off everything below, what, 200 hertz? Now the vocal has reverb on it, but none of that warmth, gross muddiness that came with it. I need to find a ceiling. And just so you can hear that reverb by itself, it sounds like this. I need to find a ceiling. I need to be content. There may be situations where you want the reverb to be big and full, like an orchestral thing perhaps, but most of the time my default setting for reverbs is to roll off all the low end because I don't want any of that muddying up my mix. Another place this happens is on delays. So I send my vocal to a delay. The delay causes the muddiness. That's why you can see here, actually, let me show you my template. These are the effects in my mixing template right now, and you can see that both the reverbs have an EQ on it rolling off the low end, and then the delays have, inside the delay itself, a low cut at above 200 hertz, just to, by default, to make sure that there's not a lot of thick grossness down there. Now, let me show you, this is the vocal effects starter kit. So whatever system you use, if you use Studio One, obviously you can use a lot of the exact same ones that I'm going to show you, but the bigger picture I want to show you is down here, the types of effects that I have. I have found, and I've had basically this layout for years with maybe one change. I had a spring reverb in here for a while that I don't really use much anymore. This is like my Hall of Fame vocal effects setup. So there's the vocal track itself, and then I have a room reverb. This is just typical, you've heard it already, just to give a little bit of space to the vocal without anything super dramatic. I need to find a ceiling. I need to be content. Then the next thing I like to have is a bigger reverb. A lot of times what I'll do is it's a plate reverb, and I have it set to a ridiculously long. Hang on, here's my, by the way, if you want to screenshot these and save it, here are my settings for that room reverb. It's about a second or so decay time. And then here is my second reverb, which is a plate reverb. So plates don't have a lot of early reflections, but I've got this set to have a big honkin' 6-second decay time, which sounds ridiculous, and you might think there's never a use for it, but I'll tell you, I love the way this sounds on a vocal with just a little bit blended in. I need to find a ceiling. I need to be content. I'm on something. So with just a little bit in there, not the big boosted one that I did, it has this nice long tail that's kind of still going. It almost creates another part. And as long as you EQ it so it's not muddy, it can be a really cool thing for your mix. The next thing I like to have is a slapback delay. I use it probably too much, if I'm honest, but I love it. For a song like this, it probably doesn't make as much sense, but for a rock song with a lead vocal, it is money. It just gives it an instant vibe. I need to find a ceiling. This is actually, I normally don't have it in stereo. That's kind of the default setting here. There's a new version of this plugin that defaults to stereo, but here are my settings for my slapback delay. The main ingredients are 120 millisecond attack, no feedback, or 120 millisecond delay, no feedback, and then rolling off the lows and the highs a little bit to get this. I need to find a ceiling. So for a really aggressive rock song, there's nothing better. Next, I have a couple more delays. Now, you can just have one of these if you don't see yourself using a lot of delays. I like to have a lot of delays at my disposal. The first is what I'm calling I clicked the wrong thing. The first is, it's kind of a short delay, long delay. The first one I have set as a quarter note delay, which sounds like this. I need to find a ceiling. And then the second one is what I'm calling a half note delay, or just a longer delay. It sounds like this.
I need to find a season.
Okay, that was actually both, which sometimes I'll do. I'll have both delays on at one time, but here's just the half note delay.
I need to find a season.
Okay, and here's what those settings look like. Here is the quarter note delay there, and then here is the half note delay. It's just a different delay plugin in Studio One, set to half notes, and it kind of does a little bit of like a ping pong back and forth sort of thing. But with those, I'll change those on a song by song basis. So the short delay may become a dotted eighth note delay. The long delay might become a full whole note delay. That part I don't care about as much, but I default them to quarter note and half note. So I've got those available to me, and I can do exactly like I said, where I say, well, I really want this vocal going to the quarter note delay and the half note delay and the plate reverb and the slapback. That's a ridiculous amount, but let's see what it sounds like.
I need to find a season. I need to be content.
Just ridiculous. But there are, especially I feel like in the last decade or so, there are certain styles of music where something like that with even more effect and reverb is kind of the vibe for these more ambient style songs. So don't be afraid to add multiple effects, have them on send so you can control each of them individually, but then start experimenting with sending one track to multiple different ones. And you may, what I find is when I do that and just kind of goof around, I usually stumble into something interesting that I wouldn't have found otherwise and I wouldn't have thought of. But once I heard it, it becomes like something I want to do over and over again, which is really how you develop your skills in things like music production, right? Okay, hope that was helpful for you. Go mix a vocal, use one or all of these or steal the whole set if you want. Make it a part of your mixing template so they're always there just waiting for you to send anything, not just vocals, to them to make your songs a little bit more interesting. If you haven't, one more time, if you haven't checked out my 5-step mix guide, it's 100% free. You can read it in one sitting and it will help you transform your mixes. So go to recordingrevolution.com/5-step mix to download your free copy. Thanks for watching. See ya.